about halfway up the tower, looking down on the burning ship, I remember the dream I'd had the night before. Changed my mind and went back down.
The music teacher started beating his ruler on the desk, telling us we'd been told to bring a pencil. At that very moment, the building began shaking and walls began to crumble.
Daddy opened the front door, stepped into the living room, and said the whole damned place was going to blow up.
All hell broke loose.
Thunderous noise, loudest I've ever heard.
Louder than bombs exploding.
The entire waterfront appeared to be on fire.
It was just like a war. We heard a lot of rumbling, and then it exploded. Glass, furniture, buildings, and everything were falling down all over. We didn't know what happened.
As I went out my back door, I could see the debris falling from the sky.
The blast created so much heat you could see it. You know, like in the summer when heat rises above the sidewalk, everything was crooked. The ground, the sky, and all the houses.
Even after 50 years, I still get a tightness in my chest when I remember what it felt like.
The blast picked me up. There was the sensation of free fall. The next thing I remember, it felt like I was underwater. And I thought, I guess this is it.
I was thrown into the air and hurled into the chain-link fence at Monsanto. The fence rolled up with me inside. I was on my hands and knees gasping for air because of the vacuum caused by the explosion.
It felt as though the house had been lifted and set back down on its foundation.
I thought maybe we were being bombed. The sirens were blowing without let-up. It reminded me of the air raid drills we had during the war.
One lady standing there had her hands over her mouth and was making whimpering sounds. I asked her what had happened. She could not answer me.
Our building at Pan Am rocked and the windows fell in. I'll never forget the feeling underfoot and throughout my body as the foundation and flooring moved.
Our house caved in and was sitting on the ground.
Searching for my dad, I saw someone covered in black standing in the blown-out skeleton of a train car. I didn't recognize him until he smiled at me and I saw his gold teeth. I carried him for what seemed like a lifetime, laid him on the side of a ditch and looked for help.
My husband and two co-workers were engulfed by a wall of water.
I recall no noise. It was like a silent movie. I guess the noise of the explosion was so loud it knocked out your hearing and you were senseless.
Everyone in the dock area was black from soot, oil, and sludge from the harbor.
Near the ship stood a tank of molasses. It ruptured and anyone nearby was covered with it.
I looked for Mom. She had been hanging out clothes not too far from me. Now she was in the front of our house, some 40 yards away, lifted by the blast, carried over the house, and set down in the front yard.
All the clothes had disappeared from the clothesline, and our chickens were gone.
I was on the roof of the house I was building for my son. The blast knocked me into the ditch below.
Daydreaming at the moment of the explosion, I was staring idly out of the window at school and became an eyewitness to the blast.
Our teacher was knocked over to the doorway, and everyone was hollering. Glass flew across the room. The principal ordered that the doors be locked to keep the students in, but I got on the ground, crawled out an opening, and ran all the way home. While I was running, the ground was shaking.
Large pieces of metal cut into our car, shearing it like a piece of cloth.
My husband was covered in oil, and his pants legs were shredded up to the pockets.
I saw the cloud from the explosion, and in later years realized it looked like a cloud from the atomic bomb.
The blast caved in the south wall of the city hall. We all deserted, leaving the vault door open. Later, I came back to see if everything was all right.
When I was running to Monsanto to find my father, people were laying all up and down the streets.
At Beeler-Mansky Clinic, we had no electricity and no water. All we could do was cover people with blankets and towels.
Under the shadow of Monsanto, so many homes were completely destroyed. That's where a lot of lives were lost.
Fire and twisted metal were all over. Dazed people were trying to make it to the main gate.
I went to the telephone office to help out. That had to be the most awful day of my life. Windows and doors were blown out, and the building was full of broken glass and debris. Everyone was crying and confused.
My daughter was at school helping the little children through the transom because the doors were jammed.
I remember seeing the tiny Catholic church that was demolished. Only the statue of Mary was untouched.
You'd recognize neighbors and friends walking down the street, but they didn't see you. All they were thinking about was that school and getting their children out.
When we arrived at the Monsanto building where she worked, it was clear they were all beyond help.
After our third trip to find our young son, we were frantic. Then we saw him sauntering through the yard. He said, "School's out."
I guess it wasn't my destiny to die that day. All the people I'd been sitting with were killed.
Dr. Beeler, who had served in the Pacific during World War II, said he had never seen such severe injuries.
When I reached City Hall, it was chaotic. But every time I needed somebody to take charge of a problem, the guy always seemed to be standing there.
Our entire fire department was wiped out, so volunteers came from Baytown, Pasadena, Houston, and Lamarck.
Nothing but devastation everywhere I looked.
We saw people running down the streets full of oil and grease, and some were bleeding, not knowing what to do or where to go.
People were holding their arms, limping with injuries all over their bodies. Some were partly clothed, some had no clothing on at all.
Clark's department store gave away clothing free of charge to those whose clothes had been blown off or ripped to shreds.
I saw so much damage in glass, clothes, and jewelry on the sidewalks all along 6th Street.
The scene at my parents' store haunts me still. Men, women, and children were running down 6th Street in terror, some naked, some in nightclothes, some barefooted. Most were bleeding. Mother and Daddy had raked all medical supplies off the shelves and laid them outside the store. Daddy stopped one man to give aid, but the man refused, saying he was fine. In his shock and panic, he didn't realize he'd run from the south end of town with only one foot.
People were streaming toward Dickinson down to old Highway 75, mostly in the ditches to avoid the oncoming traffic congestion of the two-lane road.
They announced at Ball High there'd been an explosion over in Texas City. Emergency people were transporting the injured from there, and we were to be dismissed to try and help out.
The National Guard and the Army came to our immediate rescue, and others poured in from everywhere.
All day long, cars with bullhorns drove through town announcing, "All able-bodied men go to the docks."
I belong to the Three Scouts, and we were called to clean up some of the mess in the dock area. Everything was burnt to a crisp. All the tires, paint, and inside the cars.
A guy in a van came to the docks and set up a ham radio, our only communication till DPS came. When they got there, he just up and left, never gave his name. Guess he thought he had done his duty.
The biggest plane ever to land in Texas City arrived after the explosion. A DC-3 carrying medical equipment, supplies, and personnel came in at Happy Wages Airstrip.
I helped haul some of the injured to Galveston Hospital, going over 100 miles an hour. We went to Broadway for gas. Didn't even have to pay. They just waved us on.
The wounded I picked up were taken to Houston. This was before the freeway. I never drove so fast in my life and never will again. But seconds could mean the difference in life and death.
I transported about 30 people in the back of the laundry truck on blankets and anything they could lay on.
A car went by and someone was riding on the running board. I got on the other side and rode all the way to Galveston like that.
Every cross street on Broadway was blocked off by volunteers. They wouldn't let no one cross when emergency vehicles were on Broadway headed to or from the hospitals.
We had run out of Novocaine, morphine, and everything until Ellington Field relieved us around 5 that evening. At Wielermansky, people were laying outside. They were bringing only badly hurt people inside.
At John Seeley, people were laying on the lawns, some on stretchers and some on the grass.
An incompleted part of St. Mary's was made into makeshift operating rooms. We had to work in there with wiring and cables lying exposed on the floor. We opened up and renovated an old shop center for a mental ward, making more room for people getting shock treatment because the horror was too much for many to bear.
People from Texas City began to pour into Bay Cliff and San Leon.
It took us all day to get to Dickinson.
The longest day of my 76 years.
My mom walked back from San Leon in search of my brother. She found relatives, but not him.
My brother and I rented a boat and went all around the docks looking for our brother.
A morgue was set up in McGar's garage. Then the embalmed bodies were taken to the high school gym and laid out for identification.
Everyone in this town was touched by losses in one way or another. We lost everything.
I tell myself I cannot change yesterday.
There were lots of heroes that day.
There were no heroes, just everyone doing what had to be done.
Mother always referred to Fred Linton as a gift from God to Texas City. He appeared often with clothing, food, medical supplies, and kind words of assurance.
At the telephone office, we turned some down because we needed the circuits to try to get doctors, nurses, and blood. A death call wasn't considered an emergency. We had to do what we could for the living.
My husband gave his uncle blood in an arm-to-arm transfusion, saving his life.
My grandfather was assistant fire chief and was on his way down to the plant when he heard the explosion. Realizing what happened, he went and shut off the city's main gas supply to prevent further damage.
It was getting dark. When I turned the radio on, they were calling the names of survivors, and the first name was my husband. I laughed and I cried and got down on my knees and thanked God.
That night, our company asked for volunteers to go back into Texas City to try to tow the burning high flyer away from the docks. Our lines were on her, and heavy black smoke was pouring from her hold. It looked like the deck was breathing. We were ready to tow her, but the anchor couldn't be raised, and our captain ordered us to pull away. About 3 minutes later, as we rounded the turn in the ship channel toward Galveston, a tremendous blast blew the high flyer apart.
Although it was night, the sky lit up like high noon.
It was like a nightmare. With the first explosion, we thought it was mainly the dock area. When the second explosion went off, you realized the whole city.
State Guard with about 50 others for the following week to maintain law and order while the city became organized again.
We thanked God for our survival. It was a spectacular, terrible experience.
One day we picked Daddy up at the gym, and I tried to look in. All I saw were many bodies laying on the floor. Then my father grabbed me.
Leaving the football stadium after the memorial service for the Texas City dead and missing, I remembered past times of watching my son play ball. So much fun and excitement. Now it was a mass of flowers, and the wind was blowing the white silk robes of a state college choir. In front, a circle of all church pastors except one, Father Roach, the Catholic priest who gave his life ministering to the dead and dying. Brother Hood, with a badly broken arm gave the devotional. 600 dead, my friends and neighbors.
I left my wife and baby in Houston and moved down to Camp Wallace to help them at the final morgue. I slept on the porch at night for the 2 months that the bodies were kept there. I had a real strong feeling that one of the bodies was my brother, but we could never prove it.
The whole community pulled together. There are little stories you can remember of kindnesses people shown you that make you want to cry today. But at the time, I didn't feel anything. I just had a job to do, and I had to get through it. And when I got home at night, the fires of Texas City were still burning.
I'll never forget the smell that hung over the city for months. I decided this must be the smell of war.
The radio announced that families would take in those who had been left homeless, and there was a phone number you could call.
We Girl Scouts helped make sandwiches and coffee at the gym. People were working in the kitchen around the clock to keep enough food to feed the volunteers.
My husband did his 8-hour job, then worked 8 more with civil defense as long as he was needed.
I was a Red Cross volunteer and nurse. I worked strictly volunteer for 21 days, often 12 hours a day at John Seeley. And at that time, the idea of pay was out of the question.
Our insurance company organized a place for the many adjusters to work from.
Long telegrams came in asking for information on hundreds of names. Some telegrams were 2 and 3 feet long. Volunteers from the Dallas police flew in to help.
Carl Nessler was chosen to handle the incoming money for the relief fund.
And to think how much money they send down here from all over the country, churches and everything.
Relief benefit shows were done throughout the state and country the days and weeks following the blast. Because I was the mayor, John Beam Manufacturing Company contacted me about giving us a fire engine. They had read a report that we lost our fire engine and were trying to buy a new one, and the price had gone up fantastically. So the guy called and said, "We're going to give you a fire engine." And I said, "You're going to give us a fire engine?" Said, "Yeah, the only thing it's going to cost you, you got to come to Michigan and bring your fire chief." We went to Michigan, met the mayor of Lansing, then went out to the state capitol. No one tells me I'm going to have to address the legislature, so I had until I got to the podium to know what I'm going to say. I said, "I'm sure you've seen the publicity, and no one of your good companies has given us a fire engine. I've had fantastic treatment since I've been here. You know, we've just gotten out of the war, and there were a lot of damn Yank and rebels. Some of it was good-natured, and some of it not. But one thing I've concluded since I've been in Michigan, when they say damn Yanks, they should say damn swell Yanks." I thought their ceiling was going to go off the State House.
Hundreds of nurses and doctors came in with the Red Cross from all over the state, flying into our little airport.
The Salvation Army parked its canteens so close to the fires that the paint on their vehicles cracked and peeled. They gave away the coffee, donuts, sandwiches, and they even helped rescue the injured.
And the Army had come in, too, and set up food kitchens, serving massive amounts of food, coffee, soup, donuts, and oranges.
At one point, at City Hall, we were having problems because so much equipment was coming in. We sent everything relating to firefighting to the football field. Everything else related to bulldozers and cranes and things that pull rubble out of the way to 4th Avenue South.
For months afterwards, stores from all over the country sent clothing. A New York store sent some fancy hats, and a Salvation Army man went around the gym modeling them, giving people a much-needed laugh.